deference to that pacific spirit which characterizes Professor Strauss, if not every single syllable of his work. We toss a coin, thinking by that means to avoid any conflict. In this instance, chance or fortuna seized me. I hesitate to say by the forelock. Everyone in this room knows of Professor Strauss. There is thus no necessity whatsoever here to describe him to you. I therefore say this only. Since we know him, we know therefore how fortunate and how honored CMC, Claremont Graduate School, and Claremont are that he has chosen to retire here and to teach here. Those of us who have studied with him know what a blessing it is to be able to sit before him again. Those of us who are his friends keep silent in public as to the extent of that pleasure. Professor Strauss.
After having thanked Professor Claremont for his kind words of praise which modesty compels me to reject as blatantly exaggerated, I declare that it is my intention to speak of the Socratic question. The Socratic question, this expression is ambiguous. It may mean the question which Socrates asked and the question concerning Socrates. I will speak today only of the latter. There is no Platonic or Aristotelian or Cartesian or Kantian question in the way in which there is a Socratic question. The reason of this is that Socrates is unique among the great philosophers of all times. He is important to thinking human beings as the propounder of important teachings, but also on account of his whole life. His philosophizing seems to affect his whole life in every respect. He is the philosopher with a divine mission. Everything belonging to him, his eyes, his nose, his gait, his marriage, and last but not least his death, has a symbolic significance. He lived in every respect what he said or thought. His deeds are as important as his thoughts. There is a unique harmony between his thoughts and his deeds. Yet this most harmonious figure is at the same time strangely paradoxical. I will illustrate it by a contemporary example. In my opinion, the most important or most interesting philosophic movement in our times is the movement called existentialism, which emerged about 1912 in Germany, owing to the coming together of the thought of Kierkegaard on the one hand and of Nietzsche on the other. For both the Christian thinker Kierkegaard and the atheist Nietzsche, Socrates was of the utmost importance. And yet, when existentialism, the child generated by Kierkegaard and Nietzsche jointly, had reached maturity, Socrates has lost completely his conjuring power. For every movement has a flabby periphery and a hard core. In the case of existentialism, the hardcore is the thought of Heidegger. Heidegger very rarely mentions the name of Socrates. In the only mention which I know, he says, Socrates is the purest of all philosophers. He made it clear that he meant by this not the greatest philosopher. What does he mean by this cryptic remark? He doesn't say. Does he mean Socrates is martyrdom? Is resisting the 30 pylons in contradistinction to Heidegger's non-resisting Hitler? Or does he mean Socrates is dying for his convictions? Or because Socrates was the only philosopher in the full line of history who did not write books? No one can know that because Heidegger will certainly never give any comments on his enigmatic set. Now, in order to avoid this embarrassing difficulty, let us first consider how Socrates was seen traditionally. That is to say, by thoughtful men who had not known Socrates himself. We think first of Aristotle says that Socrates was concerned with the ethical things, but in no way with the whole of nature. And in the ethical things, he was seeking the universal. He was the first man to seek for definitions, for example, of justice. Definitions leading up to knowledge, definitions expressing knowledge of the idea of the thing. Socrates, in other words, was concerned not merely with exhorting men to live virtuously, with leading them toward virtue, but also with knowledge of what virtue is. Knowledge being understood in contradiction to opinion, however plausible. And somehow he was led to the view that virtue itself is nothing but knowledge. Virtue is episteme. A paradoxical conclusion from the most commonsensical beginnings. In a modified and simplified manner, Aristotle's view recurs in Cicero. Socrates was the first to call philosophy down from heaven, to establish in the cities, to introduce it also into the households, and to compel philosophy to inquire about man's life and manners as well as about the good and bad things. Differently stated, Socrates was the citizen philosopher, the man who philosophized not in the school or for the school, but in the marketplace, with a slight change of emphasis, the popular philosopher, the common sense philosopher. Therefore, Socrates was particularly popular in the 18th century, in the age of common sense philosophy, where it was said that the proper study of mankind is man, and that seemed to be exactly what Socrates is doing. Philosophy has been said to be of old to be self-knowledge, and that means knowledge of man as man, but also knowledge of myself, of my defects and my virtues, if any. Now, the decisive result of knowledge, of self-knowledge, in Socrates was knowledge of one's ignorance, modesties in one's claims on behalf of one's opinions, leading towards something like skepticism. There is, of course, at this extreme the danger of the loss of philosophic passion, because if you know you cannot know, why should you make any effort? Now, perhaps the greatest example of Socratism in this sense is Montaigne. I will say here at once that Socrates, in Socrates' phrase that he knows that he does not know, the emphasis is as much on he knows than he does not know. And therefore, the impulse to inquiry is implied in his statement. But if I may put the emphasis on what I regard in this respect as the most important point, Socrates represents, as it were, an experience repeated again and again throughout the ages. There was always a towering edifice of science and scholarship, and its bearers were naturally filled with the pride of knowledge, if not with the pride of authors of infolios. Then a simple man, a layman, an idiotes, stands up in a way awestruck by the Tower of Babel, but also not awestruck, his awe being ironical, as people say. A layman who sees through the alleged wealth, the more or less well-conceived poverty of these personalities, and he appeals from the pride of knowledge to the humility of common sense. Now, the Socratic question would then be this: can the wisdom in conduct, that wisdom which men may acquire through the experience of the human condition, as people say now, can that wisdom be separated from philosophic inquiry? And the Socratic answer, I believe, would be no. The Socratic question presented itself in a different guise after the meeting of Athens with Jerusalem. The believers in divine revelation were confronted with this alternative. Socrates is the philosopher above all others, who was groping for the light coming from revelation. Socrates, the pedagogue, the pedagogos toward Moses or Christ. And yet, on the other hand, Socrates, the model of the philosopher who was as such unable or unwilling to listen to revelation. The letter was expressed in the Middle Ages as follows. Socrates said to the people of Athens, I do not deny your divine wisdom, but I say that I do not understand it. I am wise only in human wisdom. In other words, Socrates is definitely the pagan who cannot be converted to the sacred truth. And of the pagans we have heard that their virtues are splendid vices, and therefore there was always a temptation to find the vices of Socrates. That was not too difficult. There was, in the 18th century, not far back, as you see that, a Lutheran theologian wrote a booklet with the title, Socrates is neither a dutiful husband nor a praiseworthy father of a family. And he had perhaps some others. This form of the Socratic question predominated from the time of the Church Fathers until the 18th century inclusively. When Erasmus said, sacred Socrates, or saintly Socrates, pray for us, that is a wrong alternative, and repeated in a way in a well-known passage in Rousseau's work. But perhaps the most important utterance regarding the Socrates in this great age up to the 18th century is one by Sir Thomas More, which I will read to prove that this life is no laughing time, but rather the time of weeping. We find that our Saviour himself wept twice or thrice, but never find we that he laughed so much as once. I will not swear that he never did, more like to know. But at the least wise, he left us no example of it. But on the other side, he left us example of weeping. End of the quotation. Thomas More knew, of course, that exactly the opposite is true of Socrates. Socrates left us no example of weeping. But on the other side, he left us one or two examples of love. Now, the Socratic question took on a third, and as it seems, its final form, owing in the 19th century, owing to the radical questioning started by Nietzsche. That questioning had some kinship with the Socratic questioning, as no one knew better than Nietzsche himself. For instance, as Nietzsche somewhere says, it is a true judgment of scholars that men of all times believe to know what is good and bad, praiseworthy and blameworthy. But it is a prejudice of the scholars that we know it now better than any time. And you know that this has changed. Scholars don't say that anymore, but up to Nietzsche that this was really true. Yet both at the beginning and toward the end of his career, Nietzsche's questioning is directed with great passion against Socrates. Nietzsche's philosophizing was meant by him to be at the same time anti-Christian and anti-Socratic. So that the old conflict between the pagan Socrates and Christianity or Judaism for that matter became insignificant. What Nietzsche intended in his anti-Socratic Socratism appears most clearly from the extreme statements that he made in his first book called The Birth of Tragedy. Nietzsche regarded Socrates as, quote, the simple turning point and vertex of so-called world history, unquote. He ascribed, in other words, to Socrates the place which, according to the Christian view, is verified in Jesus. He considered Socrates within the context of the science of aesthetics. His concern was not merely theoretical, however, but a concern with the future of Germany or of Europe, a human future that must surpass the highest that man has ever achieved before. The peak of man hitherto, according to Nietzsche, is that manner of life that found its expression in Greek tragedy, more precisely in the tragedy of Aeschylus. The tragic understanding of the world, that peak of all human understanding, was, according to Nietzsche, rejected and destroyed by Socrates, who therefore is the most questionable phenomenon of antiquity, a man of more than human size, a demigod. The non-tragic understanding initiated by Socrates is identical with a theoretical or scientific understanding. Socrates, according to Nietzsche, is the first theoretical man, and that explains why he has this singular attraction, and yet also it's a singular paradoxical. Socrates is the incarnation of the spirit of science, radically unartistic and amusing. Quote, in the person of Socrates, the belief in the comprehensibility of nature and in the universally healing power of knowledge has first come to light. That Nietzsche's explanation, Socrates is saying that virtue is knowledge. Socrates is the prototype of the rationalist and therefore of the optimist. For optimism is not merely the belief that the world is the best possible world, but also the belief that the world can become the best of all imaginable worlds, or that the evils that belong to the best possible world can be rendered harmless by knowledge. Thinking cannot only fully understand being, it can even correct being. Life can become guided by science. The living gods of myth can be replaced by a deus ex machina, by technology. Rationalism is optimism, since rationalism is a belief that reason's power is unlimited and essentially beneficent. Science can solve all riddles and loosen all chains. This is what Socrates stands for according to Nietzsche. The full and ultimate consequences of the change effected or represented by Socrates appears only in the contemporary West, in the 1870s, let us say, where Nietzsche wrote this piece. In the belief in universal enlightenment, and therewith in the earthly happiness of all within a universal state, and in such philosophic movements as utilitarianism, liberalism, democracy, pacifism, and socialism. These consequences by themselves are for Nietzsche sufficient proof that the time of Socratic man has gone, as he put it. Accordingly, Nietzsche has to hope for a human future beyond the peak of pre-Socratic culture, early Athenian culturalism. I mention only one peculiarity of this attack on Socrates. Nietzsche treats the Socrates presented by Aristophanes in the crowds and the Socrates is presented in the Platonic dialogues as identical. That seems extraordinarily preposterous, but it has a simple foundation. Both Socrates, the Socrates of the clouds and the Socrates of the Platonic dialogues, are passionately concerned with knowledge or science, with episteme, and therefore the difference is of secondary importance to Nietzsche, who was concerned with art in contradistinction to knowledge. Now it is very easy to dismiss Nietzsche as an extremist. He himself knew that he was given to extremes. He spoke of the magic of the extreme. But this dismissal, which is so easy, presupposes that there is a safe and sane moderate position, a mainstream manifestly superior to the extremes. Such a mainstream could be, for example, our scientific culture. But there is this difficulty. Our scientific culture has been deeply affected by Nietzsche in the following way. there were two German academics who were the first men who learned from Nietzsche something, and they were Georg Simmel and Max Weber. And they led to that profound change within social science, according to which social science must be value-free. This doesn't come from John Stuart Mill or from David Hume, as some people like to believe. It comes indirectly from Nietzsche. And I say this without any misguided sympathy for the German contribution in particular. Nietzsche himself questioned the possibility of any purely theoretical knowledge, of objective knowledge. According to him, all knowledge rests on foundations which are historical, on historical decisions, on value decisions, even physics. And these foundations cannot be validated or invalidated rationally. Even modern physics is not more than one possible interpretation of the world among many, and therefore not, in the last analysis, objective. Now, what Nietzsche's academic followers of the first generation, Simmel and Weber, did was this: that they tried to save the objectivity of science by declaring all value judgments, and only all value judgments, to be beyond the competence of reason. In other words, it was a kind of blunting the edge of Nietzsche's attack. Now, at any rate, it is at this point that people circumstanced like myself, social scientists, become compelled to be concerned with Socrates. How much we would like to make only studies, say, of his election here and the political sociology, we cannot disregard another for the following reason. Until the time when Nietzsche began to affect social science, social science was a valuating science. And social science was this from its beginning until the 1890s. Now, of course, social science up to that time could have been merely naive, something like astrology and alchemy. Or was it aware of something of which we are no longer aware? The value-free social science is exposed to certain difficulties into which I cannot go. We can speak, I believe, of a crisis of social science connected with that value-free character. This fact forces us to consider the earlier social science, and in particular its foundation, and that means Socrates. We thus become confronted with the Socratic question in the narrow sense. What is it what Socrates stood for? In contradicting the question of the worth of what Socrates stood for. Now, this question of what Socrates stood for is a historical question, but a historical question of more than historical importance, since it is inseparably connected with the question concerning the foundations of political or social science, and even of philosophy or science as such. The earnest and passionate study of the history of philosophy as history began in the 19th century. In a way, we must continue the work started then. But there is a fundamental difference between the approach we must make and the approach started in the 19th century and surviving with great numerical power in our age. And the reason is this: the history of ideas, as is sometimes called, as it developed in the 19th century, was based on the premise, was based on belief in the foundations of the Western world. However skeptical people might speak, and that was part even of the proprieties of language to speak humbly about foundations of the Western world, yet it was these foundations were nevertheless taken for granted. We are confronted with the fact that these foundations have been shaken, and therefore our study of the great tradition can no longer be traditional either in the traditional sense or in the modern 19th century sense. As regards the way of study which came into being in the 19th century, one may describe it as genetic in two senses. First, people were very eager to study the genesis of the thought of a thing. Probably the best known case is that of Plato, trying to find out what the young Plato thought, the middle Plato and the old Plato, and perhaps one knew one could find out when a certain conceit emerged for the first time in Plato's mind, and so on. It's this kind, but the deeper meaning of Genesis is the genesis of the thought of the thinkers out of the spirit of their times and their nations. I.e., when you study Plato, you must know in the first place he was a Greek, and therefore blessed or cursed with the peculiar opinions or prejudices of the Greeks. If you do not start from that, you will not understand it. One can give us another example, Machiavelli, who was of course a man of the Italian Renaissance, if not of the Florentine Renaissance in particular. Now I say we are no longer permitted to proceed in this manner because life is now much too serious for that. From every point of view, the Socratic question, in contradistinction to the question regarding the other great thinkers, has this peculiarity, namely that Socrates did not write books. In the case of Plato, you can quote, as it were, from the horse's mouth, or at least it seems. In the case of Socrates, you cannot do it because it's always mediated by other people. Now, there are four primary sources, and I will devote the rest of this lecture to this more technical, but not unimportant and not uninteresting. There are four primary sources. The first is the comedy of Aristophanes, the Clouds, which I mentioned before. The second are the Platonic dialogues. The third is Xenophon's Socratic writings, and the fourth is Aristotle's, a few but very weighty remarks which Aristotle makes. One could say one should give the preference first to Aristophanes for the simple reason because he is earlier, older than the three others. And this is, I regard this as a sensible suggestion, but it requires, of course, that we know or learn first what the comedy, and in particular an Aristophanean comedy is. Otherwise, we will misunderstand the great jokes which Aristotle makes. But in doing so, we come to see a Socrates through Aristotle, who is very different from the Socrates whom we know through Plato, Xenophon, and Aristotle. A head of a school who is in the first place a student of nature, and a teacher of rhetoric, a sophist, one could say, or more cautiously and politely, a pre-Socratic Socrates. Such a Socrates existed. Everyone who deals with these matters knows a passage in Plato's Phaedo 96 following, where Socrates on the day of his death tells his friends that when he was very young, he was engaged in this kind of natural science, natural philosophy, what the Greeks called physiologia, but then he turned away from it. So, but he did it already. And there is also the story in the Apology of Socrates by Plato of the Delphic oracle. That the Delphic oracle induced him to engage in the kind of inquiry for which he became so famous, what he did on the marketplace at the tables of the money changers. But there is one indication which is usually not sufficiently considered. When the Delphic oracle said that Socrates is the wisest or something of this form, or something of this kind, he was already known at that time as a wise man. He was already known as a philosopher before he started out on the mission so beautifully described in the Apology. So there was a pre-Socratic Socrates. But we are interested naturally in the mature Socrates, the Socratic Socrates, if I may say so. Now, of him we know nothing through Aristophanes. We would have to turn to Plato, Xenophon, and Aristotle. And here the prima facie evidence is in favor of Xenophon, because Xenophon knew Socrates himself, whereas Aristotle didn't know him, only to reports. And as for Aristotle, everyone admits that Plato's dialogues are works of art of the first order. Plato was not a historian. But Xenophon showed by deed, by writing his Greek history, that he could be a historian. So I think we should pay due attention to Xenophon. Now, that is today, that is a part of the reigning superstition, if I may use an old-fashioned expression. And Xenophon must not be taken seriously, because he was narrow-minded and simple-minded, a kind of the tired conner who was mightily interested in horses and dogs, and in farming and such things, and in virtue in a very general way, riding straight at the fences or so. Couldn't possibly have understood Socrates. The most beautiful proof that this is a prejudice, with all the unpleasantness of prejudice, is given by a remark of that very venerable scholar John Burnet, who tried to explain the fact that, I quote from memory, how come that people like Xenophon and Meno were attracted by Socrates? Answer, because of Socrates' military reputation. So in other words, Socrates was such a wonderful soldier that even such a retired colonel with his proper moustache, a Colonel Blind kind of man, would nevertheless. Now that is of course sheer nonsense, because Xenophon doesn't say a word about Socrates as a soldier. What we know about Socrates as a soldier from the primary sources is only what Plato tells us, and especially through the mouth of the drunken Alcibiades. Now, and this only in passing, it is a prejudice. Now, and the first thing one has to do if one is confronted with a prejudice is to fight the prejudice with another prejudice. And I will limit myself to one such rhetorical line. That non-simple-minded thinker called Machiavelli refers to Xenophon more than to Plato and Socrates and Cicero combined. Now, if Machiavelli was impressed by Xenophon's sharpness, we have an inducement to look for that sharpness on our part. Now, the chief work of Xenophon is the what in Socrates has a title Memorabilia, the usual Latin translation. Not the memoirs, not memoirs of Socrates. The title Memoirs would fit much better Xenophon's work entitled Anabasis, the Ascent of Cyrus, where he tells his life story, his own deeds and speeches. But this other work has also a funny title, because the Ascent of Cyrus is presented in book 1 or so, and the bulk is devoted to the descent of the Greeks from the interior of Asia Minor under the leadership of Xenophon. So that is quite funny. Now, what Xenophon indicates by calling this book Memoirs tout court, not Memoirs of Socrates, is very clear. These are my memoirs par excellence. What I heard from Socrates, about Socrates, is the most important event in my life, much more important than this beautiful withdrawal from Asia Minor to the coast. Now, the theme of the memorabilia is this. In one word, because the time, is Socrates' justice. Socrates presented as just. A, he did not commit the crime of which he had been accused. B, he was just in the deeper sense because he was benefiting everyone he came in contact with. And so that is the bulk of the memorabilia is devoted. Now, justice is of course a virtue of the utmost importance, but it is not the only virtue. And therefore, look to present Socrates as just is nevertheless a limited presentation of consideration of Socrates. In the memorabilia, we may say Socrates abstracts from that in Socrates which transcends Socrates' justice. Naturally, only a fool would say that the other Xenophonic works deal with Socrates' injustice, because if you take the simple example of a shoemaker, he is maybe a just and honest man, but that is not his art of shoemaking. So there could be activities of Socrates which do not fall under the heading justice and do not in any way qualify his fundamental justice. Now, Socrates abstracts in the memorabilia from everything which transcends justice. An example. He asserts that Socrates studied only the human things, meaning the moral and political things. And yet the same Socrates in the memorabilia develops a doctrine of the whole, a theology, a teleological theology. And he also, as Xenophon asserts, never ceased considering what each of the beings is, not merely the moral and political beings. And there are other examples into which I do not want to go. One passage is particularly interesting, perhaps, and that is a remark in the memorabilia to the effect that Socrates treated different people differently. Those who contradicted him in a given point, to them he addressed the question, what is that thing which you to which you refer here? For example, a man says, this was a great general. And Socrates says, what is a great general? Before we see whether X was a great general. This what is question he applied when he was contradicted. But when he was not contradicted, when he was completely in control of the axiom of the disposition. Then he proceeded, Xenophon says, through the opinions of men, through the opinions which men generally accept, and so he brought about a unanimity which no one else brought about in the same manner. This latter kind of dialectic reminds Xenophon of Odysseus as described by Homer, and who was called a safe speaker. So there is a twofold dialectics. The dialectics leading to agreement, and this is achieved by not transcending opinion. And on the other hand, there is a dialectics leading to the truth. But this Socrates applies only to what Xenophon here provisionally calls the contradictor. He calls it more specifically in another place of the Memorabilia, the good nature. Now, good nature does not mean what we now understand by a good-natured fellow, but a good nature means a man who has necessary mental equipment for tough studies. And the strange thing in the Memorabilia, and perhaps in also private writings, is that there is never a conversation with a good nature, with a man possessing good nature. The peak is missing. Xenophon points to these peaks in various ways, but he never lets us see. He makes us expect, for example, a conversation between Socrates and Plato, and that of course would be quite quick. Xenophon does not whet our appetite but does not satisfy it, and you can say the very simple reason is that this goes beyond human power to write a dialogue of 2 or 3 pages between Socrates and Plato. There may be fools who have tried it, I do not know, but it would be at any rate a foolhardy enterprise. I do not want to, one can perhaps state the principle for understanding the Memorabilia as follows. One must see and read not only what is there, of course, that's the first point, but one must also see what is not there, and yet pointed to, obviously, by the author. Xenophon himself has stated the principle guiding his literary activity in a speech occurring in his Amabasis, the end of Book 5. But it is noble as well as just and pious and more pleasant to remember the good things rather than the bad ones. Observes the single comparative, more pleasant, because it can be pleasant to remember bad things after you are through. But generally speaking, it is noble and just and pious to remember the good things. In brief, to be a good boy, without resentment, without quarreling with providence. And this characteristic of Xenophon, on which he acts all the time, makes him so unpleasant to the 19th and 20th century reader, because we want to have a kind of tougher dishes that Xenophon does. A simple example from the analysis. He said they came to a certain city, and that was inhabited and prosperous and big. Fine. All good points. And then later on he says they came to a big city, omitting, prosperous, inhabited and big. And then he says he comes to a big city, meaning that it was not inhabited and was not prosperous, because people had run out. But this negative thing, uninhabited, poor, he doesn't say. I will illustrate it by an author, by the mouth of an author of the 18th century, in a way the heyday of love of Xenophon And that is Jane Austen. At the beginning of the last chapter of Manuscript Parts, who says, "Let other pens dwell on guilt and misery. I quit such odious subjects as soon as I can, impatient to restore everybody, not greatly in fault themselves, to tolerable comfort, and to have none with others." Now, Xenophon is here, and Jane Austen is here. No doubt about that. And we can learn something of that via Jane. Now, if I had infinite time, which I don't have, no one has, I would go on and speak briefly about the three other Socratic writings of Xenophon: the Economicus, the Symposium, and the Apology of Socrates, but I'll postpone it to another occasion because I have already a trespass on the time, if not on your good nature. Thank you.
If any of you have to leave, feel free to walk out now. But those who want to stay are welcome.
And I am able to say something before the question. Oh, of course. Early enough. And therefore I think I bring the conclusion of this lecture, which is necessary, with the view to the beginning. You remember that I spoke at the beginning of why Heidegger said Socrates is a purist or what the basis can be, and that whether this might not be connected with the fact that Socrates didn't write books. And I would like to add a remark to this. The Socratic question is in a way contained in the fact that Socrates did not write. But what does this non-writing mean? Writing is essentially defective, Plato, Socrates says. But Plato showed by these that one can write books which are free from the essential effects of writing. Now, in another Platonic dialogue, the Symposium, Diotima speaks of three kinds of eros. All eros is grounded in desire for immortality or eternity. And the highest form, we might say, of this eros is philosophy. This Socrates and Plato have in common, this highest form. The lowest form, according to Diotima, is the generation of children. This is not men generate children for the sake of immortality, not only of, but of themselves. It is like that their stamp is impressed somehow on their children. Now clearly, the generation of children does not guarantee immortality, even in the loosest sense. Not even if a man generates 10 or 12 children, he doesn't know whether his children will generate children or if they generate them with everybody. So this is not the most important. There is the next higher thing is immortality through the spiritual generation of children. And that means in particular through writing, say Homer was written. The specific motive of this kind of the quest for immortality is love of honor. Love of honor not for little decorations, but eternal glory, as people used to say from above. What Diotima suggests is that there is no man, however high, however dedicated to the highest form of the striving for immortality, which is philosophy, where no longer one's own immortality is involved, but the contact with things immortal. No man, however high, can live without participating in one or the other of the lower kinds of help, generating of children, or writing books. Now, let us look at the two men Plato and first. Plato wrote books, but he did not generate children. Socrates generated children, but did not write books. And that is perhaps the peculiar purity of Socrates, that he did not write books. Now, if we look, as we cannot help looking, at Jesus, we see that Jesus did not partake of either of the two lower forms of errors, generation of children and writing. And this is perhaps a question for us, whether we have not to find fault with theology on the ground of the facts. To this question, I'm sorry.
Aristotle both generated children and wrote books. Yeah.
Yeah, no, possibly. But you have got the difference in so as Plato.
Are there any questions?
Often the reason given for choosing Plato over Xenophon as an interpreter of Socrates is that the arguments that Xenophon puts into the mouth of Socrates read like sketches of arguments that are given in Platonic dialogues. There are details omitted, but you can recognize the similarities. What do you have to say about that line of reasoning?
Well, what is wrong with sketching? I mean, a developed argument is easier to follow as a sketched argument. It's true. But on the other hand, sketches are also quite good because they compel you to elaborate the argument by yourself. If the argument means, however, that Xenophon's arguments are sometimes of atrocious illogicality, I would say the same is true of the arguments of the Platonics. So this is what Xenophon is a narrow argument. I mean, meaning he also has this unbelievable power of Plato. But he knew it and acted upon it. He made the best of it. And what else can you expect of him?
I think the presumption of this line of argument is that Xenophon copied the arguments from Plato.
Yeah, but these are mere cases. It is much more reasonable to assume that Xenophon and Plato belong to the surrounding environment of Socrates, to those who were together with Socrates. And that they, in various ways, presented that Socratic action by excellence is raising questions. And probably all the stories, either in Plato or in Xenophon, are invented. But no one can know that. There might have been such a scene as that with Protagoras, or that with Meno and the Meno, who knows? But since we can't know it, it is a waste of time to think about it and to say, well, let us understand what we get from what we learn from this story, which, if not true, is presumably well invented. No, the main objection to Xenophon is that he named down. A term which would never be used by scholars in books, but that's what it means. It ain't right. That is simply idiotic. Return.
I'm afraid, Professor Strauss, that I am committed to genetic fallacy by the fact that I'm professionally historical. And am terribly conscious of the difference that time makes in the dialogue between any present and the past. And you speak as though there was one Xenophon. And I'm terribly conscious of the fact that I have been reading a 19th century edition of Xenophon in the classic series. But set against that is a translation of Xenophon by Sarah Fielding, which is an 18th century translation, which is a very different Xenophon.
I know. You know, that you raise a great question whether we can ever transcend our historical situation. That is a very
You see,
serious...
I'm trapped in my profession.
No, I understand that, and this is, I think, most contemporaries and even most contemporaries whom I respect very highly believe it is impossible. I don't know. And I believe I act on the view when I try to understand, say, the memorabilia, or for that matter, the Protagoras or the Gorgias, that it might be why I don't see the intrinsic impossibility. The argument, the inductive argument to which you refer, and Salafiri, and then this wonderful Mr. Bacon, whom I like very much, who looked at Xenophon as if he were a boy from Harrow, or so, very charming, and obviously not true. Is this true?
Partly true. Only partly true, not untrue.
Yeah, sure, that's true. Yes, only part, that's right. And then the induction is based, I think, on others. Because neither Salafiri, nor Bacon, nor Reichenbach, or whoever there was, were in a profound need, under necessity, it was not a matter of life and death question, to understand that on its own terms. And I believe, owing to this terrible fact that we live in an age in which all convictions and certainties have lost their power, not for all individuals, but for the time, makes our concern with the past much more serious, much more passionate. And if we speak of induction, I mention another fact. If you think of the way in which in the 19th century the greatest classical scholars believed they could know the dates of each Platonic dialogue, or of each section into Thucydides for that matter, and what Thucydides wrote, say, prior to the piece of Nicias and after the piece of Nicias, this kind of thing. And today, I think the best scholars have become very doubtful whether that can be done. Should Xenophon probably change his mind on any questions? So he lived very long and had plenty of opportunity for that. But that is a fair assumption that what he wrote, say, around 370, would have been very different from what he wrote around 350. The question is whether we can know that. And more particularly, the question is if we are confronted with a difficulty, say with a contradiction. Is this contradiction necessarily best explained by the fact that Xenophon changed his mind? Could it not be due to the fact that his intention differed in one book or the other? Agesilaus and Seneca, one is a phrase of Agesilaus, and the other is a history. This alone explains why he changes words, because rhetoric, especially epidactic rhetoric, requires a splendor which would be unbecoming in a history. That must be decided in each case on its own merit, I believe, and it would be wrong to accept this tremendous edifice of scholarship as the, in fundamental respect, sound. It may be, but I think it needs now some truth which was not required, say, prior to World War I or even prior to World War II.
I don't think you're falling into my own genetic fallacy by saying that disease makes it possible for us to get a truer Xenophon than an age that was less hungry.
Yeah, but there could be something else. There could be that our situation, as it is now, as it has come to be now, is in itself much closer to classical thought than, say, the 19th century. And that is the certainty of progress and ever-increasing progress, or going with it what is called philosophy of history, and which made it so sure for the men in the 19th century that in the philosophic questions, at any rate, we are on the top and they are only humble preparers. Aristotle already knew. Already. Unbelievable.
This makes us allies of the 18th century before progress.
No, yeah, the 18th century was also already in the 18th century. But the point is whether this uncertain, this chaos, intellectual chaos in which we live, it does not bring us closer to the earlier unprotected times. I mean, think only international law. The decencies acquired since the 17th century or so. And then when we read what happens to prisoners of war, saying the European tragedy, well, we have it again. I mean, neither sex nor age is in any way a protection. All the possible sufferings and misery extremes are possible again. And in this sense, we are today, unfortunately, more sober, more, quote, realistic than the nice gentlemen of the 18th and 19th century. That is the reason why I believe we have a chance of understanding which did not exist in these more protected times, where people knew or believed to know things which are unfounded.
Thank you.
Mr. Panger?
You said that while for Nietzsche the question and problem of Socrates was very important, for Heidegger this has ceased to have its importance.
Yes.
I wonder if you could say something about why that is.
Oh, that is a very long question. I don't. I can only, let me repeat only the part. I think if you would go through the works of Heidegger, I haven't read everything, almost everything, you would find references to Socrates very rare. The only one which I remember is the one which I referred. But to Plato, abound. I'm sorry, to Nietzsche abound, and to Heidegger and to Kierkegaard, there are also quite a few, especially in his earlier life. Why this is so is, that is a long question, which I am not able to answer without thinking, without giving first a presentation of what I believe to be Heidegger's view. But one could perhaps assume that may be simply that Heidegger would say, for practical purposes, Socrates and Plato are undistinguished. We have to speak of them. Could be such a simple. I don't know. You know? Because otherwise you come up against this difficulty, what is Socratic or what is non-Socratic and the and the saver therefore to say, I don't speak of Socrates at all. If you have made this advanced decision that Xenophon is negligent, and there is no sign that Heidegger ever revised his judgment of 19th century classical scholarship about that. Mr.
It's not clear to me the distinction between, say, the importance of looking for Socrates as Socrates was, and the importance of understanding, say, Plato, Socrates, as Plato understood him, Xenophon and Socrates as Xenophon understood him. Or, let me add a remark. That Xenophon shows by deed that he's capable of writing history certainly does not mean that he wrote history in the same way that, say, modern scientific historians write.
No, not inclusive.
Not inclusive. And therefore, it would seem that the difficulty presented by, say, Plato never speaking in his own name is perhaps less visible, but certainly there in the fact that Xenophon wrote the speeches of Socrates, or put the speeches of Socrates.
Yeah, but on the other hand, the first rule of reading can be stated as follows. I think I stated it already today. Be a good boy. Be not distrustful, be not nasty, and so on. So now when Xenophon tells you, I once heard Socrates say this and this, well, I give him the benefit of the doubt and say, I heard you heard him say so. Perhaps I will later on be compelled to the wiser judgment and say that he simply lied. It's lying, which we say. Lying, however, in no worse than any novelist. Who also says, Madame Bovary did this and this, and there was no novelists never existed. But still, we have to go through this thing. Xenophon raises the claim that he tells us stories which actually have, and he raises his own name, but never does. Either the scene opens and you see, say, Socrates and Gorgias, Apollos and Callicles, or whatever it may be, or someone, not Plato, maybe Socrates, tells you of the battle, but never Plato. I admit that this is rather jocular, but it is not my fault. Then it is jocular because the whole situation is jocular because of the unserious character of writing, to give you the Platonic or Socratic answer to this question. And the most important point, after all, is not whether this conversation took place, but for example, what is justice? That is our question.
No, that's what I was really asking.
Sure. But for some reasons which I cannot now explain, it's not 117. Plato and Socrates and some other people of this kind felt that you cannot raise a question of what is just properly except by telling stories. I have been told that the Chinese are in the habit of telling stories rather than proceeding scientifically by definition. In a way, although the way of storytelling in Plato and Xenophon is very different, I suppose, from the Chinese, but in this generality they seem to agree. And that is the reason why my first course on this campus is devoted to Aristotle's ethics, because there is no funny business. There is it seems to be the case. And therefore we learn talking about justice without any difficulty. Plato, we hear certain assertions made satisfying Glaucon perhaps and Parmenides, but not necessarily ourselves, nor necessarily Socrates. And so we have to invest some more later. That's the last question.
Good. I'd like to ask a question of some who address this last phenomenon that you point to. And I would begin by first addressing myself to one remark you made about Nietzsche's interpretation of Socrates as either singularly inartistic or destroying other influences. Or yes, so the first theoretical method. And to contrast that with, for example, Hegel's understanding of Socrates, then just generally, for example, Hegel's understanding of Greek spirit as the plastic artist, and Socrates sculpting inwards, that is a supreme work of art, consciously constructing the harmonious character. And that, both insights seem to me somehow very insightful.
in order to believe that there is a harmony between Socrates and Greek art.
Well, that's what Hegel suggests at one point.
Yeah, but he must also not forget, and I say this with all respect, that Hegel has the harmonistic side to that. And therefore, if there are some disharmonies, Hegel is not the most likely place. There are some very interesting disharmonies in Hegel, and that of nice emphasis, and that's not good for me. Now, as if we proceed in our simple good boys manner, then we learn that Socrates was particularly connected with one our Euripides, who is today regarded as the least great of the three, and was already regarded in this way, I believe, by some people in Socrates' time. At any rate, in a Socratic dialogue, where a young man mentions the wisest men in the various fields of human endeavor, he mentions amongst the dramatic poets Socrates, not Euripides. At any rate, I would start from such things. There are, and also the way Socrates treats poetry, sculpture, and painting in both Xenophon and Plato. And there you see a minor difficulty. After all, at first glance, a man is justified in saying that Socrates was not very music. What he does in the Republic, throws him out. All of them, except those kind of good, simple martial and religious meanings. They would be yours.
What, could I add one point?
Yeah.
Yes. What I meant to suggest was that in a peculiar way, conceiving all this, what Hegel's insight reflects is that Socrates' own life was extremely artful, instead of being concerned with just that point. That's somehow the mystery of the
In a way, I believe I suggested that also at the beginning when I spoke that Socrates, of all the philosophers, has this peculiar notoriety or fame, and that his life was in such a perfect harmony. I don't mean to say that a man like Kant ever stole or committed other improprieties, but the stories told about Kant that he was a few times considering marriage but did never do it, and then the people in Königsberg or Kaliningrad, as they call it now, was all regulated their watches with a view to Kant's stove. That is not comfortable. With Socrates, obviously, because Socrates there's always his death at the very least as a thing quite unique and surpassing in every respect, say, the death of Giordano Bruno or any other people of whom one speaks. So, that was it. And now on the basis of the authority vested in